Okay, so let's get started, yeah? Perfect, good crowd. So let me introduce myself and also my partner in crime, Elizabeth. My name is Lukas. I am a VP of engineering here at Grindr. I've been with the company for 8 months now. It's kind of crazy to say 8 months because it seems like I just joined yesterday. Elizabeth's been with us also that long, and today we'll be focusing on Scrum. But before I go into that topic, I want to talk a little bit about Grindr to give you kind of a context, what we are, what we do. So Grindr is a company that focuses on gay dating app. We have BlackBerry, Android, and iOS clients. We have a lot of users around the globe. We've got users in over 190 countries. We serve massive, massive traffic. Just to give you some metrics, we process around 5,000 transactions per second. Technology-wise, we have Redis clusters scaled to be able to do 110,000 queries per second. So we're solving some pretty serious engineering challenges. But today we are not going to be focusing on code. Today we're going to be focusing on Scrum and Agile practices. And the reason why is because at the end of the day, as we are building engineering at Grindr, we are focusing on QA practice, automation practice, mobile development, including iOS, Android, backend development. So there, architecture, obviously, there are all these different engineering practices. But at the end of the day, when it comes to actual delivery and the rubber meets the road, you need Agile Office and Scrum or Agile practices in order for all these different functional areas to come together and deliver software, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Agile and Scrum because those are really not new concepts. I will share some of my learnings. I've been doing Scrum for many years now. And I'm very, by the way, opinionated on the subject, as you will find out. And I'm also very passionate about the subject because what I've seen in the past is that you cannot have a successful innovating engineer organization without having a strong Scrum and Agile practice that's done right. Unfortunately, Scrum and Agile has gotten a bad name, and that is because there's a lot of hacks out there that claim to do it, but they don't really do it. The Agile organization as it is shaped today doesn't really help matters because you can really get Scrum certification or Scrum Master certification very easily. And the fact that you got it doesn't really mean that you can actually do it, right? So I'm gonna talk about that. There's a section in our presentation to talk about, from my experience, what you must be doing if you want to do it right. So come on now. We've got technical difficulties. Okay, that worked. Okay, so a couple of things I want to focus on today. So again, what is Scrum and what it is not? I'm going to spend most of my time talking about what it is not. We will also talk about how to successfully implement Scrum, and I'm not going to recite to you from articles or from books or whatever. I'm just going to talk about my own experiences, and hopefully you will find that useful. And then we're going to dive into Scrum metrics. So that area is something that you don't normally see in a lot of organizations. I mean, you do things like velocity, right? Everyone knows what velocity is. People know how to use, hopefully, Fibonacci to measure Scrum with story points and all that good stuff. But there's many other metrics that you may find useful, especially if you're coming from a heavy PMO background, or if you still have a heavy PMO presence in your organization. You need to forecast things or justify things. If you want to translate sprints into measure of how much that it's going to cost me, there's a way to do that. And then Elizabeth is going to actually talk about mechanics of how we gather and how we use metrics here at Grindr, right? So I'm going to focus on just concepts. I'm going to talk about my experiences, and then we'll dive in once Elizabeth gets up here to talk about how we actually do it here. So when it comes to all this stuff, I cannot continue without also giving credit to Scott Downey, who is our Agile coach. He's hiding somewhere. He's hiding right there. So I've worked with the man for many, many years. He's been working very closely with Jeff Sutherland on this stuff. He actually invented, documented, and showed how to calculate a lot of that stuff. If you want more and more detail and actually dive into some of his presentations, some of the spreadsheets that he has available, you can go to his website at rapidscrum.com, and there's a lot of goodies there for you to download. And also he's available for hire. Okay, so that's enough of that. That's a shameless plug. So before we go further, how many of you have actually heard of Scrum before? Yes, yes, okay. And how many of you think that you're doing Scrum today? Okay, great. So one thing that I want to kick it off with is that I want to put an emphasis on the fact that people talk about Scrum as being a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, it's simply a framework for effective team collaboration. And you know, it brings some processes and roles into a picture that make things easier, but at the end of the day, it's a collaboration framework. So it essentially provides enough rules that allow your teams to self-organize and essentially provides ecosystem that allows you to kind of get out of the way and allow teams to self-organize and hopefully become hyper-productive. So in my experience, what I've seen is that when you start doing Scrum, it is very difficult to just smash people together and say, okay, go to a training and do Scrum. A lot of times it takes hiring of a qualified Agile coach. It takes to hire a qualified Scrum Master. There's a lot of different things that you have to do to enable Scrum, right? But before we go there, I want to talk about, from very high level perspective, what are some of the ingredients to doing Scrum correctly. And I included here a very simple diagram that you may have seen in the past. There are a couple of concepts here that I want to highlight. So product backlog, it's something very important, and that kind of correlates to the role of a Scrum product owner. So Scrum product owner is a very, very important function in Scrum because that's a person that's responsible for all the user story, all the things that you're asking the team to build, right? So it's essentially a dedicated person that is working very closely with the team, and they need to be available to the team at all times to be able to answer questions. So they are the ones who are actually writing user stories. I'm not going to be getting into user story writing and talking about what makes a good user story. I think you can get that from a lot of articles on the web. Also, you can go to Scott's website, you can get all that. But there are essentially rules and regulations when it comes to how to write user stories, what makes a user story actionable, and how a team can actually execute on user story, right? But product backlog is essentially something that is owned by product owner. They are prioritizing that list of user stories. And one thing that's important here is that before anything goes into sprint backlog, a product owner can actually go in and change priorities all the time, right? So this is a very fluid type of list. That's very important because one thing about Scrum is it's very iterative nature, right? So you want to have incremental and iterative time boxes in which you build software. People say that Scrum teams usually operate in 2 to 4 weeks. I would say that the best way to build software is in 1 week sprints. It's not very easy to achieve, but I think that if you look at your engineering practice as a whole, the engineering practice as a whole needs to enable your delivery practice, right? So in order for you to be successful in 1 week sprints, you have to have certain things that you need to have in place. So for example, QA automation, right? If your regression testing or testing takes a long time, then you may not be able to move as quickly, right? If you don't have a strong release management and build pipeline that is tied with your continuous integration, then you may not be able to do 1 week sprints because everything takes a long time, right? So as you're adopting Scrum, you have to remember that there's a lot of supporting engineering practices that are enabling Scrum or enabling Agile, and without them, it's kind of very difficult to do, right? Another thing is sprint backlog that I mentioned. So sprint backlog is essentially a list of user stories that a team commits to during the sprint planning. So there's a formal session that the Scrum team would go to with the product owner and the Scrum Master, and essentially they would work in the order of priority to essentially evaluate each user story that the product owner is introducing from the perspective of, is this actionable? Do I have all the assets? Can we actually is this immediately actionable? So there's a whole bunch of different principles that you should usually check whether you can actually accept the user story into a sprint. Long story short, a sprint planning and a sprint backlog is essentially this concept of teams committing to a body of work, right? Now, when we talk about metrics, this is kind of one of the first touch points when you can say metrics become applicable, and we'll talk about further down the presentation. But if you know your team's velocity, you have everything estimated, then as a Scrum Master and product owner, you can kind of take a guess in terms of how much work can be actually accomplished by the team for that sprint, right? So you can start projecting things. I talked about sprint duration. I've done 3 week sprints. I've done 2 week sprints. I've done 1 week sprints. I can tell you that here in Grindr we do 1 week sprints. It has taken us a while to get there. When we started with this, we were on 2 week sprints, and in the last 6 months, we've introduced a lot of these supporting practices that I talked about. So we have now fully automated, Jenkins build and release management pipeline for iOS and Android. We're actually calculating code metrics, so a lot of code reviews and code quality type of stuff happens automatically, and we're starting to fail builds if you're not conforming to those kind of metrics. And in addition to that, we're also doing, we're just about to kick off the automation of our smoke test, and by the midsummer, we will have at least 80% of our regression testing automated as well. So if you have that all in place, then you can start thinking about, okay, let's shorten our development cycle to 5 days. If we were to compare where Grindr was a year ago, Grindr was doing good old waterfall at the time, or they thought we're doing Scrum. I don't know, but there were 3 iOS releases that year. Between now and then, this year we had what, 20, 22, something like that. So close to 20 releases just in 6 months. So that kind of gives you an idea how much quicker you can move, right? And you want to do it in the high confidence, right? When the whole point of doing this is to allow the team to fail fast, right? Agile and Scrum is to organize your work and allow the team to be very hyper productive, but also you're putting all the mechanisms in place, allowing the team to maybe experiment with things and fail very fast and find out, okay, way before it actually goes into testing or production, that something is wrong, right? And they can calibrate and they can rinse and repeat, right? Um, Ideally, at the end of the sprint, you want to have production-ready deliverables. Big mistake that a lot of companies do is that they say, okay, well, this sprint we're gonna do development, and then the next sprint we're gonna do testing, and the sprint after that we're gonna do regression testing, and that's not Scrum, that's not Agile, that's Scrumifall. What essentially needs to happen is within your sprint, you need to do all of these activities resulting in a deliverable, a shippable product, right? Which means that as part of the sprint, you need to have developers, your QA, any sort of other functional areas working together, right? So if you have architecture practice that needs to review things, then they need to work very closely with the team to make sure that all these things happen at the same time, right? So from the process perspective, again, going back to supporting practices, you kind of have to think through how all these things flow together, right? How are you going to leverage automation tool or any sort of tools available in the market to enable your team? So the way we do code reviews, we use pull requests in Bitbucket, right? So that's on the low level, and then on the higher level, we also have very collaborative sprint planning sessions that sometimes take a day or half a day, right? So sprint planning is the time where the team is supposed to be looking at the code, they're supposed to be talking about architecture. If you want a solutions architect present during those sessions to kind of validate the approach, then they need to be available, you need to schedule that, right? So that way, by the time the team is done with sprint planning, they know exactly what the architecture should be. It's already validated. We made sure that conforms with our architecture practice, and they can just go, and build this stuff in the next 5 days, right? And then the same thing goes for testing, right? So the testers at the same time need to plan their test cases, figure out how to augment automation suite. So you know the QI practice has to essentially enable Scrum to be able to do this 1 week sprint, right? Okay, let's talk about a Scrum Master. That's a very very key role, and it's a very interesting role too, because a good Scrum Master over time is no longer necessary in the ideal world, right? I have not seen that happen ever, but that's what I heard, that ideally you want to essentially enable the team and coach the team to the extent where they just kind of become agile by osmosis, I suppose. And but the reality is this is a very key role. One thing that I would say here is that word of caution, there's a lot of Scrum Masters who are essentially project managers that went to Scrum training, and that doesn't make you a Scrum Master, right? Scrum training doesn't give you, you know, it gives you a license to drive maybe, but if you want to ride in a competitive race course, that's not gonna happen. So, and I'm gonna talk about that a little bit later. You know, if you want to do it right, there are some key steps that you need to do as an organization to make sure that you don't miss and you actually enable people right. And then there is a Scrum team. I touched about that a little bit already. So again, Scrum teams are cross-functional. One thing that I want to say is that, and I see some of my guys here in the audience. I give this spiel over and over and over for people who work for me. I don't micromanage people, right? I treat each Scrum team as a startup, right? So our company backlog is essentially a product that you're building as a startup. I will provide you with engineering guidelines, right? Things like, okay, well, we agreed as engineering that we will do test-driven development. We agreed that we're going to conform to certain coding standards. So there are some underlining principles that I will enforce, hopefully through a lot of automation. But aside from that, it's up to you, Scrum team, to kind of coalesce and figure it out. So if you want to innovate, if you want to do whatever it takes to essentially get this done in the most efficient, collaborative way, right? It's actually pretty fun to watch when you stop doing this command control, approach that you see in a lot of organizations that are PMO driven, where you have to have an architect to decompose the work, and you have to a manager to figure out who should be working on different pieces, and then you have one project manager assigned per developer. And by the way, I've seen that ratio where you would have 1 PM per developer too, which is crazy. And that just doesn't work, right? So the way I like to do Scrum is that, again, you treat Scrum team as essentially a startup. You give them guidelines, you give them all the tools that they may need to be effective and become hyper productive, and then you just have to get out of the way, right? I know it's probably easier said than done, but you know, teams go through different phases of you know, storming, norming, forming, storming, and performing. But trust me, once you enable the team, once you step off, it usually takes 5 to 8 sprints for them to coalesce, but if you are patient, it actually pays off. Okay. So, my favorite topic, what Scrum is not. So a lot of conversations that I have in LA tech circles, a lot of times is about, oh, we are agile, therefore we don't do code reviews. Or we are agile, therefore we don't do architecture. Or we are agile, therefore we don't do testing. Or we are Scrum, therefore we don't do X, right? I hate that because it seems that a lot of people are using Agile or Scrum as an excuse to not to do certain things. And again, I'm going to go back to what Scrum is and what it's not. Scrum is a communication framework. It doesn't dictate anything that deals with your engineering practices, right? So if you want to have a strong engineering practice, then Scrum as a delivery methodology is just part of the picture, but it doesn't dictate anything about documentation, whether you use Java docs or not, whether you do code reviews or not, how you define architecture, how you do QA. All these different things are still need to be defined by your engineering practice as you're building it. And in fact, the stronger those practices are, the better quality of your code is, right? So again, Scrum is very just part of the picture, and I hate when people use it as an excuse not to do things. I'm not sure if you actually heard that before, but I heard that a lot in the past, where we're like, oh, I'm not going to document I'm not going to document this code because we're agile, therefore we don't do that. That's it's crazy. And similarly, Scrum does not define business practices. One caveat here, though, I would say is that the business needs to change in order to enable Agile and Scrum. And that's because a lot of businesses are set up as a command control structures, where there's like this top-down approach, and everything comes down from the mountain, and then there are little worker bees that are doing the thing. If you want to Scrumify your organization and enable these autonomous, cross-functional teams, it will take a lot of business process practice re-engineering to get it right. However, Scrum will not tell you that, oh, I don't need customer service, or I don't need shipping, or I don't need all these different key functions, right? You still need to think about those things. However, you may need to realign your business as a whole in order to enable Scrum. Just to give you an example, in a traditional organization using Waterfall, a typical engineering manager can manage maybe 6 up to 10 people, right? In a Scrum organization where managers are more viewed as servant leaders, and they are there to enable the team, remove obstacles, work on the engineering practice. They are no longer responsible for maybe day-to-day delivery, who's working on what, checking things constantly. You know, an engineering manager can manage probably 20, 30 people. So if you think about that, that's kind of scary, because that means a lot of people are going to be out of the job, right? So that's also a reason why Scrum and Agile is such a scary thing to bring into your organization, especially if you've been doing PMO for a long time. It was a very rigid command control structure because number one, you know, a lot of people will have to realign and change, and we all know we don't like change. But in order to be successful, it has to be recognized that you know, you need to essentially alter how you are structured in order to have full adaptation of Agile and Scrum in your company. If you don't have that, then you have something we call guerrilla Scrum, right? So there's some couple of guys in the corner decided, let's do this Scrum thing, and they're doing kind of the stealth implementation, one department or maybe two departments, but it never actually is supported from the top, right? And those are some of the most difficult deployments. Usually those are very, very political because you have existing PMO in place, and you've got project managers that are now very scared of their jobs. So I'm not sure if you've ever been in an organization like that. It can get pretty nasty. I can give you an example. I was working for a company where engineering essentially decided to go Agile and Scrum, and there was huge pushback from PMO, but we did it anyways, and we've proven things through metrics. So we've actually showed 4x delivery improvement, right? And after 6 months, we were doing not 2 teams, but 5 teams. And then after a year, there were 10 teams. And after that, PMO was disbanded, and we established Agile Office. And 27 project managers were no longer there, but we had 4 Scrum Masters, right? So that's an example of how sometimes it goes, right? And I don't want to paint it as a scary thing, right? I just want to say that when you're adopting Scrum, you can go a couple of ways about it. The best way if the company adopts Agile and Scrum from the top down, right? Starting with the CEO and all the C-suite, getting training, getting their thinking realigned, right? And that's just kind of goes. Scrum does not define org chart, but it definitely influences it, right? And also Scrum does not define company culture. Again, it's just a communication framework, but it very much influences it, right? So we have to be very aware of that. And going back to my previous points, Scrum cannot stand alone, right? So Scrum needs these supporting practices to be in place, to be successful, and it also needs support from you know, the whole ecosystem to do right. Because at the end of the day, Scrum and Agile is very hard to do. It's not easy. I mean, you're asking a whole bunch of strangers to all of a sudden highly collaborate, and you know, you're expecting QA guy to work with dev guy, to work with the front end guy in the same team. And so far, they've been very protective about their turf, and maybe they've been communicating. They're sitting beside each other, but they're communicating through comments via Jira. I've seen that too, right? Or you've got people sitting at the same table and they're Skyping to each other because no one's talking, right? Yeah, that's crazy. When I see that, I go insane. Okay, so let's talk about quickly about successful Scrum implementation. I've already touched about a couple of these points. So from my experience, if you want to do it right, the best approach is to actually have executive buy-in, right? And that's in contrast to guerrilla Scrum, which is, you know, essentially a team or department decides, you know what, we're tired of this thing, we're going to implement Agile. And they try to do it, but they kind of do it as a covert thing, right? And there's this constant friction with PMO because they are doing Gantt charts and they're walking around and what are you working on? What are you working on? What are you working on? And they're like, well, I can't tell you, I'm doing Scrum. So that's one thing. Another thing that's very, very important, I cannot highlight that enough, is you need to retain a qualified Agile coach. And I know that's investment, but I've seen it. If you think that you can just go to you know, Scrum Master training or a product owner training and come out of that and magically be enlightened and do it right, then that's not, the reality is very different, right? You actually have to do it, you have to see it done in practice. There are people with various different levels of certification, but hiring a qualified Agile coach is a key. So we've been very fortunate that Scott actually had time in his busy schedule, and he's been helping us to reboot the Agile practice here. Step number 3 is hire a qualified Scrum Master. These guys or gals are not very easy to come by. There's a lot of people out there that have CSM on their resume, but if you poke a little bit deeper, you know, they just took some course 2 years ago, and ever since they've been doing something completely different, right? A qualified Scrum Master it's an extremely difficult role, and I'm sure Elizabeth is going to share some of her stories. But you know, you have to be a psychologist, you need to be a technician, you need to understand technology, you need to understand human behavior. There's just a lot of different things. You need to be very pragmatic, right? You have to stay very cool because there's a lot of friction sometimes on the team, and you have to be able to extract yourself from all the fray and still make sure that the rules of the road are followed. While gathering metrics and answering to executives about, like, you know, where's my stuff gonna be done? So that's not very easy. And I don't think Scott would agree with the 4, but I've used Kanban or Scrumban as a gateway drug, right? So we've successfully rebooted some teams with Scrum, but that was purely because Scott was there on site and he was helping us. And when he was not there, you know, I had I think 6 months to 9 months where I actually had to carry the torch and deploy Scrum to another 10 teams. And what we ended up doing is that there was a lot of pushback from business, there was a lot of pushback from the developers, so what we ended up doing is like, okay, well, let's do this Kanban thing or Scrumban and kind of slowly introduce certain practices as people are getting used to. So you will not get the hyper-productive team very, very fast, right? But in a very political environment, it'll give you chance to train people and actually prove through metrics the value of certain things. Okay, and another thing that I want to share is don't expect hyper-productive teams in geographically distributed environments. And this may not be very popular because it seems everyone is gang-ho on going nearshore or offshore or distributed, and I want to work from home and in my PJs and all that good stuff. So my advice is don't do it. Don't ever do it, right? There's a workplace, and there are seats, there are workstations, butts in the seats, people collaborating at the desk, ideally sitting in the same area. That's the best way, right? I know that's utopia because in today's environment, you know, it's very difficult to hire top talent, and you need to go sometimes to the next state or somewhere else to get the talent that you need. But if you do that, do not expect a hyper-productive team without a lot of effort. So we've achieved very high productive teams in the past, but what that meant is that, you know, for each team that was remote, I actually had a guy that was flying into on-site every month, and they were rotating, and there was like this telepresence thing and a lot of money spent. At the end of the day, you will never get the same conversion. You'll never get that 4x, 5x, 7x. And then the last thing that will lead me to metrics is essentially, you know, you can use metrics to bridge the gap between traditional PMO and Agile Scrum. So PMO is very metrics driven. They've got these Gantt charts and man days and man weeks and all this other stuff. You know, unless you're able to measure your progress, measure your team, and start forecasting when you can actually deliver on projects, you're in a very difficult spot, because at the end of the day, everyone wants to know when you can get your stuff done, right? Okay, so let's talk about metrics, how to measure Scrum. And I took a photocopy of a voting array that is used by our Android team. And as you can tell, we are using Fibonacci. I'm not going to talk about Fibonacci and why use Fibonacci. That's a separate topic. You guys can read up on that if you don't know. But at the end of the day, Fibonacci allows me to essentially assign a measure of complexity to a user story, right? Why would we use Fibonacci versus man days or man hours or hours? We are terrible in estimation and time as people. I mean, we all know someone asks you, when can you get this done? You say 5 minutes, 2 days later, you're still working on it, right? But we are very, very good about comparing things, right? If you look around the room, if I were to ask you to describe why this chair is similar to that chair, you can very quickly tell me why, right? Or why this desk is similar to this other desk, right? We are very good at that concept, comparing things. So what we do essentially, you allow the team to, through sprint 0, to work through a body of work, some user stories, and at the end of that sprint 0, you essentially look at what was accomplished, and you essentially go through the exercise where you pick something that we call a keystone. And a keystone is essentially a user story that from that point forward is used as a reference for that team for either number of 5 or 3. I mean, people differ in that regard, but what we usually do is okay, find something that's easiest, and you go through an exercise when the team actually defines why it's easiest, and they list, you know, something like, okay, it's simple algorithm, we're not writing new algorithms, so there's whole bunch of things that the team needs to agree why this user story was the easiest, and then we just arbitrarily say, okay, from that point forward, this is a 5, right? And then the next time you're estimating, then you say, okay, compare your work that you've just done against the keystone, right? Is this twice as complex, 3 times as complex, 4 times as complex? And over time, you essentially come up with these comparison user stories that you can essentially assign to these numbers, and that simplifies your voting from day to day very quickly, right? Because now the team knows that 5 is this user story, they can go back, they can look at the code, they can learn. 8 is that user story, 13 is that user story. So now we are business not thinking about time, we're simply comparing one work to another work. It's like comparing one chair to another chair, right? So that's how we measure Scrum here at Grindr, and that's how I've done it. I've seen it done very effectively in other places. Any questions on this? It goes infinite, really. So that's a good question. So when you get into some of the other metrics, there's a metric that Scott came up with that measures accuracy of estimation, right? So over time, you can actually see which user story, story point, they have the most success in terms of being right, right? And then you can say, okay, well, I can tell that, you know, every time you guys are starting to size something at 34, 55, or 89, you're really not accurate. And it kind of makes sense, because what happens is that as you increase the size, the complexity gets larger and larger, and people are having trouble giving a true estimate, right? So as you start measuring the stuff, you can actually see that usually people are very accurate around 5, 8, 13s, and then as it goes larger, it becomes a little bit hairier, right? One thing here to note is that a lot of times you hear people in Agile organizations say, oh, this team had a velocity of 100, and then this other team had a velocity of 200. Therefore, the first team sucks, right? And you cannot do that. You cannot compare velocities between one team and another team. And the reason why is because velocity is essentially a group thing for that particular team. Only they know what 5 means. Only they know what 8 means, right? And that's why you cannot say this team has a velocity of 100 or 200 or whatever, and you cannot compare that. And again, that goes back to the fact that in order to be as accurate as possible, you essentially come up with this keystone, you come up with the storyboard array of user stories that this team knows very intimately, therefore they can size their work. You may ask, well, how can I compare teams and how can I, align teams and come up with timelines and all this other stuff? We'll talk about that, right? Yep.
You mentioned that people have a hard time measuring time on projects, but after the fact, how does it relate to issue price? For instance, profile 34, was that 3 times longer than 30?
It's 3 times the effort. So you wouldn't talk about time, right? It's a measure of effort for a team. If you want to talk about time, the only time unit that I would suggest you ever talk about is a sprint length, right? So if someone asks you how long this thing is going to take you to build, then you can come back and say, well, the team has estimated it. We know our average velocity per sprint, right? I can divide, right? And then I can say, hey, this is going to take us 3 sprints, right? And then you can give them a date if you want to, right? But that's if you want to talk about time, talk about timelines, forecasts. That's how you would do it. What's difficult is that since every team has its own measure of complexity, therefore each teams have different velocities, different averages. When you're talking about forecasting and aligning work and being able to tell executives when complex projects can be actually delivered, that means you need to be very, very good at having a product backlog that is being constantly groomed, and your team should be able to groom at least 3 months worth of product backlog, right? Which means that your supporting business organization, they need to have their stuff together to be able to produce that, right? It's very easy to ideate for a year and then drop stuff on engineering and be like, I want it tomorrow, right? So Scrum kind of pushes that a little bit back on business as well, because now we're saying, hey, you want us to tell you when we can get things done? Well, show me the user stories, right? Show me at least good number of them, and then we can start grooming that backlog. We can start estimating and forecasting things. It's very unfair to ask a team, when can you get something delivered if they haven't had a chance to decompose it and size it, right? Unless you want to go back to, architect and engineering manager getting together and spending 3 nights decomposing things and doing the tasks and then, oh, this is going to take us 3 months, and then 3 months later you need 6 more months and double the budget, and you've got typical type of thing. I can tell you, and I'm not very good at history and statistics, but I think it's been shown that if you do Scrum correctly, your estimation is around 80% accurate if you do it correctly. And waterfall is 50-50, so it's like tossing a coin at the end of the day. You might as well not do it. 15? Thank you, Scott. So 1, 5, and 80%. I'll take that.
Where do you get that number?
Oh, here we go. Here we go. Yeah, let's do that. So again, Scott is available for questions. He's also very, very opinionated. We don't agree on everything. So that's always interesting. Okay. Have I covered everything here? So is it clear the notion of this basic notion of being able to define a keystone. The team now has a way to compare things, right? Go ahead.
Why don't you just use like a simple 1 through 10? What are the benefits of using Fibonacci?
You could. It's just widely used, and I think the way the scale works is one number is twice as large as almost twice as large as the other one, so it works very nicely. But yeah, you can do that. If you want to do 1 through 10, you can do that as well. Right. Yes. So when you go to the grooming session, you want to always work in a priority order, right? Because what ends up happening is that at the top of the backlog, you always, product backlog, you always should have projects that are the most ready, right? So ideally, that user story at the top of the backlog is actionable, because it may happen that your team finishes early their sprint and they start looking for work. You want to start pulling stuff from the backlog, right? When it comes from the sprint backlog, the priority is set by the product owner and it never changes. And the team is supposed to work in the priority order. Yeah. Very good question. So yes, ideally you would want the business to agree to have some sort of business value metric to prioritize things. So some people use a return on investment. There are other metrics that people use. The fact of the matter is that I haven't seen an organization yet that actually use that metric very well. It's usually a business asking engineering for metrics and measure the performance of delivery, but not necessarily the actual business value that is being asked to deliver, which I also think is very unfair, and I push back on business as much as I can, because I mean if you're asking me for my key performance metrics, then I want to know why I'm busting my hump. What am I actually delivering, right? Why is this more important than something else, right? And that sometimes is very hard to answer because you have to do your homework, you have to do metrics, you have to do market research, you actually have to work. So, okay. Yes.
Are the Grindr customers actually getting a full, like a new bill every week, let's say every Friday or every Monday?
Good question. The fact that you have shippable product doesn't mean that you're going to make it live. So what we do, we actually bunch things up into probably 2-3 weeks increments, and then we ship it. Ideally, we want to submit every week, but as you know, mobile development is tricky on the iOS side a lot, and on Android is easy. You can push versions pretty quickly, but on iOS you have to go through review and all that. So that adds to the cycle. So we try to bunch things up. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to maybe ship a business functionality without other things. And that's also a very difficult conversation sometimes to have with product owners, because they have this syndrome from waterfall days that, oh my God, I got my spot in the queue, therefore I'm going to throw everything, including kitchen sink, into these requirements, and I want everything, right? Because who knows when I'm going to get a chance again to do some development, right? And then the project runs late, and it's a year later, that stuff is obsolete anyways. But long story short, a lot of people are kind of trained in their thinking that, they don't understand that it's okay to come in with 10 requirements, go to development, ship 4, and then adjust and never do the remaining 6 because there's no business value there anymore, and we shifted as a company to something more important. Right? But it's kind of like this syndrome of like, this is my project, this is my baby, I want everything done. Right? So it's a constant kind of, that's why when I talk about it's a kind of a top-down thing. The executive management, everyone has to understand that in order how to work in that mode. And if you do, you become an amazing company because you constantly are able to shift to market conditions. right? Release things that are the most important to your customers. But you also need to have supporting practices to be able to measure that stuff, right? Because you need to have some way to tell that this is actually more important. And you know, the question is, how do you do that? Right? How do you get that feedback from your market? Okay, moving on. Okay, so we finally got to Scrum metrics. Again, if you go to Scott's site, I believe he's got plenty more. I just listed the ones that I used. This is my experience. Those are the metrics that I use. The ones in the top I would use on weekly basis, and then the more you go down to the bottom, those are metrics that you would use less often. At least I use less often. Scott would argue with me, but that's Scott. So velocity, we talked about velocity. Essentially, velocity is when you have a team working a sprint, they accepted the work. All these user stories are sized. And then as they're going through the sprint, they essentially complete these user stories in accordance to definition of done. And that's something that the team also has to agree on, what that means. Usually that results in a demo to the product owner. The product owner accepts. The moment they do that, then those points are counted towards velocity, right? So velocity is essentially a sum of all your story points that were delivered by the team and accepted by product owner, right? So that's velocity. Work capacity is a metric that counts all the story points completed by the team, right? So there may be a lot of work being done by the team during a sprint, but only a fraction of that work is actually converted into velocity, because some stories may not be completed. They may be dropped. You might have started working on the story point, the user story that's 21, and you know you abandoned it halfway, but you actually completed 13 points of work. So all that stuff accounts for essentially work capacity. So the work capacity is a very interesting metric because it indicates the overall capacity of the team, right? Now, here's where it gets interesting when it comes to talk about team performance and measuring teams, right? That's something I use every sprint, and I actually a lot of times bring those numbers to retrospective to talk about teams. So the top two metrics are in red because velocity and work capacity cannot be compared across different teams, right? You cannot say, hey, this team's work capacity is 500 and the other one's 300, therefore these guys are better than the other guys, right? Again, going back to the story array, right? Each team has a different yardstick to measure their work, therefore you cannot do that. However, the moment you start comparing velocity work capacity and start calculating the ratio, essentially how much of your work capacity you converted to velocity as a percentage of work, now you have a metric that you can compare against team, and you have a metric that's actually very useful, and we call that focus factor, right? So percent of work capacity that actually has been converted to velocity is your focus factor, and the healthy metric is above 80%, right? So if your team consistently converts over 80% of their sprint backlog to velocity, then that's a healthy focus factor. And that's something that you can then start discussing with the team. If you see the team constantly have a 50% focus factor, then you can start questioning, you know, why are you guys not converting? Are you all swarming the most efficient way on top priorities? Do you have developers starting cherry picking work and hoarding work because it's more exciting, and they are not willing to work with other people, therefore they are not as effective and efficient? You can start asking those kinds of questions, and you can start watching teams' behavior, right? Or another one is, no, that's enough. Okay, Then we have adopted work. So adopted work is essentially the work that you can start measuring. You can measure. Let's say you planned for 100 story points in a sprint, and then you completed everything, and you start pulling things from the backlog. That's adopted work, right? So now you can actually measure that as well, and start seeing on percentage basis how much of adopted work per sprint a team can have. And that's also a useful conversation, because if you see that a team has 50% adopted work of a sprint, that means they're under-committing during sprint planning, right? Then you can start questioning, well, if you're adopting, if by half midpoint of the sprint, you're pulling work from the backlog, that means you are under-committing during sprint planning. Therefore, you're being extra conservative. Therefore, I'm not able to forecast and plan correctly because you're trying to protect your ass, right? So that's a metric that's also very useful. Found work is something that I watch for very religiously on teams, which is essentially if you estimated 13 points and then something became 21 points, that's found work. The differential is found work, right? And a lot of times what I've seen in my experience, it's due to a couple of things. Technical debt that is unaccounted for or unknown, and that's legitimate. However, I would argue that if you do your sprint planning correctly, and you're having actually very effective sprint planning session, you have people looking at the code, talking about architecture, deciding who's going to be working on what, you should be able to discover these things, right? If you're going through a sprint planning session and no one has looked at the code, then that's a problem, right? And then there's accuracy of estimation. I talked a little bit about that, which is you can actually tell how accurate teams are per each measurement, 5, 8, 13, and then accuracy of commitment, which is how accurate are we in making our sprint commitments, right? So those ratios can help you. If you're forecasting, if you're planning, if you know all these numbers, and you need to deliver a timeline that's long timeline, you can use these percentages to essentially pad or adjust your timelines, right? Or the number of sprints that you have to forecast for. I want to show you very quickly some examples of what I've used. This is not from Grindr. This is from other teams. So this is an example of a burn down on steroids that shows you all these different things. And it is a very, very good source of information. If you're just walking by team's story, the actual Scrum board, and you're trying to get a glimpse, how's it going? There's a lot of information here. You can see how the actual burn down is going down. You can see what work is being reported day to day. Since we're talking about it, one thing that Scott advocates is also sizing daily what the team actually resolve, what kind of complexity they resolve day to day. So normally during a stand-up, you would talk about what have we accomplished yesterday, do we have any blockers, and what are we going to be, what are we accomplishing today? So that those 3 questions. There's a 4th question that we ask, which is how much that resolved complexity was worth. So you will actually see our teams voting day to day. So they talk, okay, that one guy, I wrote this class and whatever, and then the QA says, okay, we wrote these test cases, we tested it, everything works. So they talk about what they actually resolved complexity-wise, and then the whole team would vote very quickly right there, right? And then we would capture those metrics. So anyways, that's an example of a very healthy team. They have some production support there, but it wasn't enough to abort the sprint. And then there's another chart that I want to show you, which is this, which is obviously the team was in trouble. They were not delivering or resolving complexity every day. We knew by 3rd day, 4th day of the sprint we were in trouble. And they did huge push on day 8 and 9. They delivered a whole bunch of stuff at the very end, but they never actually resolved fully what was committed, resulting with only 50% focus factor, right? So that's an interesting thing to bring to retrospective, right? Okay, very quickly, trends, talking about work capacity, velocity, and actual commitment. That's a very interesting chart because you can tell that the team was becoming very hyper proactive. Their work capacity was steadily increasing. It was very nicely matched by velocity. They were in line with commitments. Then they kind of faltered there. They have a period where they had a sprint where their work capacity was higher than velocity, so obviously something happened there. And then they did another push, and then just kind of wheels came off the wagon, right? And there are interesting conversations that you can have with, let's say, executive management about, well, what actually happened? Maybe there's a root cause in the business. Maybe changing priorities, too much pressure. I mean, there's a lot of causes for this. But now you have metrics. You can actually show, you know, if you do this to my engineering organization, this is what happens, right? We had a nice trend. Everything was going great. We were hyper proactive. And then you did these things, and that resulted in that, right? And now you're not talking about feelings. This is not your personal feeling. Those are metrics, right? And people respond to metrics, especially executives. So that's example. And here's another example. So that was another team of mine that was going through a lot of storming and formation, and they eventually recovered and they started increasing nicely. The numbers came in line, and the commitment and velocity, work capacity kind of stabilized. But they were going through a lot of personal issues on the team. There was a lot of fighting with the business. There was a lot of stuff related to requirements not being ready, or business was saying that it's ready, that we have all the assets. The assets were not ready. And that resulted in essentially this graph, right? So you can tell that it was all over the place. Usually what happens, you know, if people come to you, is like, Lukas, why so many people quitting on your team? You can, well, okay, let me show you. This is what's happening, right? I mean, and when you have a roller coaster like that, this is a very unstable work environment sometimes. Okay, I don't want to take too much time, so let's go. I had an example from another company where the team was constantly essentially working on large user stories that were not decomposed. And it's really not a good Scrum practice, but after a while, because they were really not willing to break things down, we had some problems with product owner at the time also, we essentially made a rule in engineering saying that you cannot have actionable user story greater than 21 for that particular team, and that makes sense to them. But that's not a good practice. You should not do that.
What's up? How much time do you spend planning, and do you track your accuracy of estimates, and how much time is spent planning compared to the cost of the effort? So if it's a high effort, and the percentage of planning was very low, is your estimate good or bad? Are you putting those kinds of numbers together to see, are people planning properly?
Yeah, the team has gotten better. Also, the product has gotten much better. So there was a lot of kind of meshing together that had to happen through all these different disciplines. Also, people got accustomed with code more, right? So over time, planning gets faster, estimation gets faster. Um, but your question was specifically, do we see a correlation in metrics between the length of planning session and the accuracy of estimation, right?
And you have to take in the size of what you're estimating.
Yes, and I can tell you that I don't see that here yet because we haven't been doing that long enough since the reboot. But I have seen that in other companies when you can actually go back in metrics and say that, oh my God, these guys, took half an hour and then the whole sprint was off.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a natural question.
Yep.
Because
Yes. So I mean, you can draw that correlation, but yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some noise there too because there may be other factors impeding the team, right? Rather than just, they may not maybe follow the invest principle correctly, and they're actually accepting work that's not defined well, right? So I can tell you guys that this stuff is not necessarily sexy. If you're an engineer, you just want to get in there and write code, right? But at the end of the day, if you're trying to set up a really, really strong engineering organization and enable innovation, enable all these different things that are buzzwords these other days, it comes with a lot of hard work. And the reality is that it doesn't matter how good your architecture practice is, or it doesn't matter how your QA practice is, unless you're able to bring them all together through a good agile office practice and delivery, um, and it's not going to work, right? Any other questions? What's up?
Hey, so with these metrics, how do you approach predictably, planning to expand capacity?
To plan for future work? Yeah.
Saying, making a guess that more
Right.
work will be accomplished within some time frame within teams. How
Right.
do you
Yeah.
expand and develop capacity?
So the way I've done it, and I'm sure there may be a better answer. In my previous engagement, I essentially looked at how different teams of certain makeup performed, right? And having those metrics, I essentially use that as a forecast model, right? So to give you an example, I had 4 teams in India, and I had metrics on how they performed. And then there was a question, can we just add 2 more teams and get it done faster, right? And I could give some of that answer because I could say, hey, well, we could spin up that team and gain certain velocity. But then we also had a conversation about what does that mean to agile practice and communication and making sure all the supporting practices work. So there was a diminishing return, but that's how I did it, right? I just kind of guessed.
But so you reach a point where you can guesstimate velocity.
Right.
Depending on what you say, inherently,
Yeah.
you estimate.
So one thing that's important to mention here is that your forecast in terms of the immediate execution roadmap is as good as your groomed backlog, right? So the longer your the uh, the further the horizon is in your backlog that you were able to actually groom as a team, the more accurate you are. but the reality is that a lot of things change in their company. So if you have, 4 to 8 sprints worth of work actually groomed by the team, that's very, very good, right? And that's your immediate horizon. Beyond that, you need to start using estimates. Right? Are we good? Yeah? What's up?
I just want to say I came here because I heard about this and I wasn't really familiar with it, but I've seen a huge change from how the software was a year ago to how it is today. I came to a focus group here a year ago, and it's night and day. You guys are doing whatever you're doing. Clearly this is working very, very well.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Scrum and Agile is only part of the equation. There's really, I talk a lot about in these things about Agile practice. So if you look at series, what we talked about automation, code reviews, code quality. I mean, there's so many different parts of engineering that you must do correctly in order to enable a really strong engineering team. If you're just doing Scrum correctly, it doesn't mean anything, right? There's a lot of different things that have to come together. That's why there isn't that many good engineering shops that people want to work at, right? There are companies that got that secret sauce right, but even them, it's not all the time, right? It takes. At the end of the day, you may think that you can systemize things, you can come up with a process and a templates, and you can just put people in boxes. At the end of the day, it comes down to individuals. That's why Scrum is so powerful, because it's a collaboration framework. It's very individual-centric, focused on the team working together. So I can tell you that part of our success is not only application of these different good engineering practices, but also hiring the right people. So if you were to compare who was here a year ago, none of these people are here anymore.
Just out of curiosity, well, two questions. Are you going to be having any more of these?
We have them once a month, okay. So every month.
And what is the motivation to do these?
Couple of things. So one thing that I was astounded by when I started here was the sheer volume and the complexity of engineering problems that this company is solving. The app may be simple, but at the end of the day, to scale a Redis cluster to process 110,000 queries per second is not easy, right? To process 5,000 transactions per second is not easy, right? To have a snappy response, to serve user base in over 190 countries. So this company is truly solving really hard engineering problems, yet I was really upset when I started that there isn't a line of engineers trying to work here, right? Because in my opinion is that if you're in an LA area and you want to solve some true hard problems, then come work for Grindr. So that's my motivation, right? I wanna tell people what we're doing, right? I wanna give the word out and say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is why. This is a strong engineering shop. We're building things. This is not what it used to be a year ago, right? So I'm shamelessly saying, hey, waving the Grindr flag and come see what we are doing. So obviously there's part of that. Yes, thank you. But also a big part of that is that I've been going to a lot of tech talks, and there's a lot of focus on technology. There's focus on little latest thing that just came out, and look, I built a prototype. That's not really interesting to me. What's interesting to me is how do I enable company to have very strong engineering shops, to enable innovation. So if you look at theme of our tech talks, we always frame it from the perspective, how does this relate to me being a strong engineering shop and enable innovation? How do I do that? How does Google how is Google able to build something like Google Maps in their spare time, right? I want to do that. Not on that scale, obviously, but I want this place to be able to solve things that no one has solved yet, right? So right now we're just putting that foundation. We're realigning things. We're making sure that our day-to-day business is taken care of. But at the same time, we're building those strong engineering practices. So in 6 months, I can focus on, image recognition and processing technology to do, recommendation engine, right? That's what I really want to do. Profile and pictures and multi-photo and yes.
Do you find people skipping, like when, I know a couple times I've been a victim to this, when I'm falling short on my sprint on all of the things I have to do before the sprint ends, sometimes I am like, oh my god, these specs can wait, this documentation can wait. How do you find that when you implemented this, people started freaking out and not making as many specs as they should,
It's
and how do you
it's
handle that?
well, it's how you structure your definition of done.
How do you define that? Yeah, I guess that's
So,
my question. How do you
so,
define
so, so a very, very big part of Scrum practice is agreeing with the team what the definition of done is. So there's a list of things, and if you go into that room, you look at boards, each team has listed what the definition of done is, right? And it's a combination of things like, being approved by product owner and meeting our expectations, but if you want to be a strong engineering shop, then you can also build into that definition of done, things like code review, peer review completed, or test cases reviewed by development, or documentation, right? And the key is that the more these things you measure through continuous integration, the better you are. So things like whether I can check automatically whether you are contributing to the code base classes without documentation, because we are actually calculating the documentation density, right? And if that number goes down, then I'm gonna fail the build, and everyone was gonna know why, right? I'm gonna go like, oh, you committed this code and there's no documentation. Bad, right?
Yeah, you touched on that last month, but does the specs, the tests, that all is considered part of being done in your eyes?
That's correct.
Okay.
So if you commit to test-driven development, then you measure that, which means that you measure the code coverage every time you check in a class. And if the code coverage goes down, you fail the build, right? And it's an agreement with your engineering team, and it's agreement with the business as well. So it's my job to sell a lot of these things to my boss and tell him, why are we doing this, right? But the thing is that over the 6 months, we reduced crashes by 5x, right? So, I mean, I actually have now metrics to go, hey, we're doing all these things, so this is not smoke and mirrors, it actually works, right?
I am. I see.
All right, guys, it's late. Everyone needs to go home. Yes. It's been fun. Thank you so much. We're doing another Tech Talk in July where we'll be showcasing our automation framework. We will be actually showing all the work that Bernadette and her team has done to make sure that across Android and iOS platform on daily basis we're actually running these automation tests. So this is going to be done using simulators for now, but we're also working on a framework that allows us to execute these in a cloud of devices, and we'll showcase that also in the future. Cool? All right. Thank you, guys.